All right, this is our third pop-in. We have a couple more. What I have in front of me right now, here are things not to do. I'm going to go through these in a minute. And here is something fun I want to show you at the very end for you to do with your time. If you have something like this, great. Otherwise, you can use a brush, but we're going to drop some little water things and do some fun little bubble things. And when they dry really unique. And I want that to be your own little scientific experiment. We'll do that at the end, just because, no kidding, that may take up to 12 or 24 hours to dry. So fair warning, go ahead and put it on something flat and see what happens. I think you'll get a kick out of it. So today I have some scratch paper, and I'm recommending you have some things if you're painting along. If you're just watching, that's great too. But I'm going to have some scratch paper to show some do's and don'ts of water control. I have some paper towels. My thing with paper towels is I rip them in half. They're just usable, and I use them over and over until I throw them away. But I like the size. I like that they last a little longer, and that's my thing. Some people swear by certain brands and certain tissues, but I just use whatever's on sale, and I tear them in half and go to town. I've got my water. I'm going to be using a size 8 today, but the size isn't a big deal today. You could have a 6, you could have a 10. I wouldn't go too small. I wouldn't go too large, probably for most of it. And then I do have a larger brush just for fun, a mop brush just for fun, because I want to talk about wet on wet too. So what's the deal with water control in watercolor? It's one of those things that throw so many people. And in my opinion, most people use too much water, and that's where the problem is. If it's a matter, did I use too much or too little? I have found through the years that it's probably almost always too much. So you want to have water. Let's start with some examples before we go to the ones that I painted earlier to show you. You want water to be smooth enough. I think I'm going to grab some Viridian. Any color you want to grab is more than fine by me. You want, in most cases, unless you're dry brushing, you want your paint to flow, right? You want it to just simply have a beginning, have an end, not skip on your paper. And again, if you're doing dry brushing, that's another story, and I'm not going to get into that much today. But what you want to have is you want your paint to go down onto your paper the way you want it. If you're doing a square, you want a square. If you're doing squiggles, you want little drops. Whatever you want to do, you want your brush to cooperate. Now, we all know that it matters the paper, it matters the brush, it matters about the paint, but I'm going to assume you've got decent everything, because I'm not going to get into that in this quick one today. I'm going to assume you have everything else under control, so water is the issue. Some people, when they dip into their paints, always have this tendency to happen. And I'm going to show you from the side. You're literally putting little puddles. You have too much water. The idea is to have it fairly smooth. It's okay to have a little variation, but this is puddle making instead of painting. How do you avoid this #1 problem with a lot of people? How you avoid it is to use your paper towel and even have a scratch paper close by and try it out. You know, a lot of people don't want to, they want to dip into their paint and then they want to go immediately into trying it on the paper. And sometimes you're somebody that needs to try it out each and every time. You may have to do that for years. You may have to do that 1 week. But it doesn't matter. Nobody is going to say to you, hey, did you try your paint out before you put it on your paper? It's just an option. Please use it. I don't use it, but I would if I wanted to. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a good idea. And once you see the amount you have, now you can bring it into what you're doing. As we know with watercolor, we don't use white in the watercolor for the most part. We use sometimes different effects, but for the most part, the way that we get darker and lighter is the amount of water. So if I have less water, it's going to be dark. Again, this is the Viridian. And if I have more water, it's going to get lighter. It's as simple as that. It's water to paint. So what I want to suggest with you is to think less. If you're having some problems with watermarks, with cauliflower, which means that it just kind of branches out. If this was a lot of water right here and it starts branching out into just kind of a blurry edged side, kind of like what a cauliflower looks like. We call that blossoming or cauliflower. So if you find you have blossoming and you have these blooms coming out, cauliflower blooms that you don't want, 100% it's too much water. There's no mystery there. Sometimes there is mystery on edges, and I want to talk about those in a minute too. But blossoming like this, there's no mystery. 100% too much water. Okay. Hey, Catherine, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, girl. So what I want to talk about, let's start first with wet on wet. If you've got a wet on wet, I'm going to just do it right down here. And if you're playing around with me today, let's do it together. If you're going to wet your paper first and do a wet on wet, so that might be, for example, a sky. Now I'm going to do several layers here because I want it really saturated. If I have expensive paper, 100% cotton, which I don't right now with playing around, I may have to go over it several times and you'll see it's warping. I don't have it taped down, excuse me. And I don't have a problem ever with paper warping because when I'm done, I just flatten it under a book for whatever. Half an hour usually does it, but I usually do it overnight. I just flatten it out and we're good to go. So it never bothers me, but if it bothers you in your style of painting, of course, get a flat board or use a pad and that block that you don't take it off until you're done painting. Many artists swear by that. Me, I'll just go like this, or I'll tape or whatever. Anyway, I just put water down. I'm going to put a little bit of ultramarine blue. I'm using a bigger brush, and I'm going to start putting in some clouds. If I want it a little darker, or putting in the sky first. If I want it darker, I can put a little darker in there. But what if it was doing this right now? What if it was puddling? What if when I tipped the paper, it literally was running off the page? That is what you do not want to do. Now, let's say I did that. I didn't test it first, or I didn't realize how much water I was pulling up. What do I do if I do that? This is where your paper towel comes in handy. If I'm making clouds, I probably want to pull it anyway. And now I'm going to do it even earlier. So when you make clouds, don't scrub, just tap gently, move your paper towel around so that you don't leave little paper towel marks. But when you're making clouds like this, you're good to go. I'm going to show you a quick little tip that's kind of fun. If any of you ever own any of these, let me show you what you can do. You can stick that thing right on it. And you could use something that you get from, for your dog or for medicine. The secret is to first push the little cushion, make it flat, pull it on a puddle, and suck that baby up. And here it is. I'll show you how much came out. So if you're working on something and you got a puddle starting and you want to retrieve it that way, I find that it does not leave marks. I find that I put it right on the base of my paper And it's just a little trick. I don't use it a lot, but sometimes I really want to use it. Sometimes there's a big puddle. I don't want clouds. I don't want to pull something up with my paper towel. So I'm just going to get one of these. I forget what it's called right now, Pistoli or something like that. You can buy them on Amazon. Most of my things you can find on Amazon because I'm the Amazon queen. These are made for art. When I've had my last workshop, I handed one of these out to everybody in the fall one in Myrtle Beach. So if anyone's watching this is a good way to do that. Let's go back to this look. So now you have some clouds forming and you can decide with your water control, do you like them bleeding out like that? If so, leave it. Sometimes water will paint better than you and I can. And I see people going in and fixing things that really didn't need to be fixed. And I'm going to encourage you with your water with this quickie about water control, to enjoy the surprise of water and don't overwork it and don't overfix it. If I want to fix a little something here and there, that's fine. But look at how cool this look is with the water just flowing around. And I don't want to interrupt that. So I'm going to leave that one be and see what happens. I'm going to show you real quickly some errors that I did on purpose for you to see. This is some of the blossoming that I was talking about, which means too much water. But this over here is a hard edge when I didn't want a hard edge. And hard edges are one of those kind of weird things, like how did that happen? I find that hard edges, even though in theory it's because of too much water that formed that edge, I find that's not always the case. I find that some of my paints are prone to a hard edge more than others. And sometimes a brush will push it into a hard edge. So as I told you earlier, use less water in your paints when in doubt. But the second thing I want to show you is if you do get a hard edge, I want to show you real quickly how to fix it. I dropped some water in here and it blurred out, and look how pretty that is. That I don't know what that looks like, maybe an island from the sky. I was trying to make it look real ugly so I could show you how to fix it, but I fell in love with it instead. Here's a hard edge here. Here's a hard edge here. And here's a hard edge on top of the blue, and so is this. So I'm going to fix this one. And what I do to fix a hard edge is I rinse my brush. This is my tried and true method that I'm sharing with you. I rinse my brush. I tap off excess as if it's a washcloth that I'm wringing. You don't want it bone dry, but you want all the excess off. And then I go very gently into the hard line. And it may take me 2 or 3 tries, but I'm just gently pulling that hard line off by tapping. If I overwork the hard line, here's the part I just did. If I overwork the hard line, then instead of having an area where the hard line is missing, now I've pulled. Pulling is the same system. Rinse your brush, take off excess, and work it. Work, 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 tap it off, start over, and I can make this as light as I want. This is lifting paint, but we're not talking about lifting right now. We're talking about softening edges, and I don't want the water to dissipate to the point where I see the white of the paper. And so instead, I'm going to tap it gently. I'm going to tap it very, very gently and blur the edge very gently. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to stop. And here's a little dot here that I think fell from it. I'm going to stop before perfection. So I no longer have a line, but I still have it just kind of blended out. So that's something fun for you to try to do too. So in review, I want to remind you, Too much water is usually the culprit. It should not be puddling on your paper unless you want it to. It shouldn't be blossoming on the paper unless you want it to. Here's a puddle here that dried as a puddle. It should be flowing the way that you want your paint to flow in any manner you use. If you don't have a brush that can hold the water properly and you need a little bit better, that's another story altogether for a different day. But if everything else is decent, you want to have your paint be your best friend. I also want to remind you real quickly to dip your paintbrush into the water. If I have paint and I'm painting away and it's now becoming dry, which it's not, let's pretend it is. Instead of starting from scratch and swooshing off all the paint, rinsing, starting all over with my paint and coming back, just tip your very tip into water, just your very tip. A lot of times what I do is I rest my pinky or my ring finger, just the very tip. And what happens is now you've activated a dry brush. A lot of times it will give you the perfect amount of paint when you dip to reactivate. So that is a little something that I probably do 50% of the time I'm painting is I reactivate it instead of starting over. I make sure I'm not using too much water. And if I find I do, that's what this paper towel is for. You see on the edge, I tap off the excess and now I've got the right amount. But if I'm still not sure, I'm going to test it on a scratch paper before I bring it into my paper. Hope that makes sense. As promised, I want to show you a little trick as we're ending. I think we're going over the 15 minutes, but between friends, what's another minute? So if you have a paintbrush, I'm going to have you do it this way. I want you to simply make a big old bubble. And you can make it bigger or smaller. I'm just going to start tapping in some bubbles. And you can tap on top of the ones you already made. You can make them pretty big. You see me, I'm making some big ones. And I want to marbleize some paints with you. To me, this is just fun. And I'm sure there's some paintings that we could do this with. Those of you that took a class, I think it was last year, maybe the year before with me, where I blew with straws, all kinds of paint all over, and we really made some pretty cool things. These would be a good starting point for that. If you do have like a pistale, whatever it's called, boy, do these make beautiful bubbles. Let me show you. You can just make amazing bubbles with these. So however you do the bubbles, go ahead and do a few just like that. And then I'm going to put paint in them. And the reason, and yes, you can also do paint bubbles, but instead I want to show you what it looks like when you add paint to your water. And it's the coolest thing. Here's the sideways view of it. I'm adding paint. I'm adding Viridian because that's the color I'm using just from the side, and letting it kind of marbleize a little bit. And I'm going to use maybe a few other colors as well. And I'm just going to leave you with the fun of making these crazy colors in your water bubbles and just see what happens when they dry. The ones I did yesterday, and here's how they ended up drying. They're going to flatten one way or another, but I took pictures on my phone and I might even post them. I took pictures at 3 hours, at 6 hours. I did them in the morning, and by George, they weren't even still flat long into the process. So here are my fun little things. This has nothing to do with anything except enjoying how the magic of watercolor is all about as you're creating all these fun little things. And those are the ones, I have my table slightly tipped because of the fact that I have a camera and I don't want it too shiny. So I paint with it just slightly tipped, and that's, I think, why they went that way. But I'm dying to know what yours do, if you do it on a flat table or wherever you are. So
Cool.
that's it, guys. That's the fun of a few tips from me, a couple little moments of ideas for you to play with water control and using dip in the tip, don't over rinse, just freshen using paper towels, and to use less water than you probably think you need.